The Gospel is quite puzzling at first view. The Protestants would almost take it as a pleasing rebuff to the Blessed Mother. In the intuitions given to Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich, we have this scene, and the intuition, indeed the revelation given to that very powerful mystic, was that there's a whole backdrop which isn't clear in the Gospel itself, but which she was given to understand with great clarity. It happened like this, apparently, that when Our Lady came, she saw what was going to happen, that out of delicacy, her son would make way and address her presence with great respect, and thereby she would be put in evidence and brought to the fore, which was the last thing that she wanted. So there was a communication between their soul, and the Lord picked it up and deflected immediately the attention away from her with this saying, which she therefore understood perfectly. So that therefore gives us a better idea perhaps of what actually is the undercurrent here. And by the way, it contains the whole of the spiritual life. Anyone who does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother, and so on. Doing the will of the beloved, as in the case of relationships. One sees it, doesn't one? In true love, one anticipates the will, even vaguely perceived, of the beloved when it is delicate. Whereas later on in marriage, that goes, unless one is careful, and one exerts a certain pressure and coercion so as to attain one's own will and pleasure. I often think in that context of St. Maximilian Kolbe, the martyr of Auschwitz, who was also before, remember, a great formator, very large number of people he brought towards sanctity when he was a younger Franciscan. And he would give them lessons, and one day he wrote on the blackboard a formula, and it would have been whatever language he was using, this in English: S, sanctity, is there when small w, the will, equals and completely equals big W, the divine will. It's all there. And the Lord has it also with great insistence in the farewell discourse in St. John. If you do what I command you. Otherwise, our friendship with him is using him, switching him on like a tap when we want to, manipulating our God. It doesn't work. As in human relationships, it doesn't work. The saint that we are feasting today did that to the utmost limits of human capacity. As a young man, he had perceived the call to go to a monastery not too far from where his culture had put him in the world, which was an interesting culture. The Oriental spirituality, very monastic, still in tow, and cannot be otherwise. You know why, don't you? All the bishops there are taken from the celibate clergy, and therefore are all monks, practically. Therefore they have a certain intensity of spirituality coming from the top, and it does actually penetrate. Therefore he entered this Maronite community. Eventually he was ordained a priest. And remember that in the Eastern spirituality, even those rites which are in communion with Rome, as was his, there is, by the very nature of things, less of a danger of what we in the West tend to fall into if we're not very careful. It's the fact that their celebrations are not as frequent. They can't be, because they're all solemn and last 2 or 3 hours. Therefore they tend to be on Sundays and feast days. there's a lot of truth in the old saying that familiarity breeds contempt, so be careful. And I put it in because there's more of it, not less of it happening, e.g. people going more than once to Holy Communion and sometimes going even the very limit over what is allowed, because in canon law the word that came in 1983 was iterum, again, and that was questioned immediately, what did that mean? And the Vatican answered very clearly, just in very short formulas as they always do, a second time, not more. Iterum meant again and not repeatedly. Just be aware of that. Never go beyond a second one. You don't have to go all the time like that to Holy Communion to increase your devotion. It's not a question of maximum but optimum. And often one, actually St. Augustine says so, one can show more respect sometimes through abstaining to avoid the other. But it's the same in everything pertaining to the sacred. Because if we are coming often into the sacred, and by the way, it's the danger of people like myself who live under the same roof as the Blessed Sacrament. If we're not careful, we can start talking with a loud voice in the house, putting on music and all the rest of it, forgetting that we're surrounded by angels. And we must be very careful that when we come into that angelic presence, we open our eyes to what we cannot see with our body. There's a double presence wherever the Blessed Sacrament is. The Blessed Sacrament never comes alone. Even right now, because the Blessed Sacrament at this moment is not reserved in this chapel, but there are angels waiting for the Word. And because we will expose the Blessed Sacrament with a second host for a while afterwards, they'll be there with us, adoring. But in a church where the Blessed Sacrament is there, they're still there, and a great number of them. And what are we doing? There's a double presence at that point. We ourselves are tabernacles, therefore there's an angelic presence around us. You know the story, I forget which one it was now, whether it's Philip Neri or the Curé Mars. A lady went out of church immediately after Holy Communion, and he whispered to his altar boys, "Follow that lady with your candles." And they followed her all the way home with 2 big candles, and she got the message. But we, perhaps, are offending the Lord quite a lot by that. It's enough to start talking when we don't have to, especially in church itself, because it's a very rude way of hosting the Lord of Hosts, to at that point give more importance to a human being than to the Lord of Hosts inside us with great intimacy. We have not understood the greatness of the Blessed Sacrament, and it is precisely the result of what has happened in the West, where we've got very used to what the Pope, Pius X, was aware could happen if he made it more available. And he tried to insist in that early document, which allowed Holy Communion to be more frequent, tried to warn not to fall into that rut, because he could see the damage that it would cause. Be careful. Familiarity breeds contempt. Now, this saint eventually, in prayer, because he was spending a lot of time in prayer, felt the nudge, as can happen when one exposes oneself to much adoration and prayer, to go further and to ask for what can be asked for, permission to become a hermit. Physically separated from the monastery but not too far away, under the obedience of the higumen, the abbot. And off he went up to the mountain, and on his own, in very difficult conditions, no heating at all, and great austerity, with that one consolation which he had, rather like a newly beatified soul like him, in a different way, Charles de Foucauld, who had a great devotion to the Blessed Sacrament at Tamanrasset, in solitude, and died more or less as a martyr down there. These, when they had no human contact, came eyeball to eyeball with the living God. And that can be your experience too, if you take the risk, especially at night, or any time when you're only there with him and no human being, because it's the same as between human beings. Two's company and three's a crowd, in a sense. There's more intimacy at night with your beloved, when there's complete stillness. So if that is available, or if you can make it available, zoom in on that, because things happen at night. And people into adoration big time will tell you the night is the privileged time of intimacy. And when I do Eucharistic retreats, I tend to like that to happen, that there should be adoration all night, both nights if it's a complete weekend. And it does make a difference. You just take 1 hour each, and those who have those moments come back and discreetly thank you, because that was the time when they entered into mode full time, big time. So he was given permission, and eventually, without any fuss or bother, just became a burning lamp, drawing people as happens. In fact, we have an earlier example in the East. It's Seraphim of Sarov. He was canonized in the equivalent there, where they do it in the East way back, but he lived at the end of the 1800s, and he lived a very austere life as well. But that amazing openness to people was in him too. When a person would come and find him, man or woman, whatever age, he would say, "My joy," welcoming that person as sent by God and his providence, a lesson unto us, that we receive people as sent by God and not another nuisance. And so he just was. He did not do, but he was. And eventually that being continued, because he petered out. There was no photograph of him, but his presence was there, as it were. People visited the hermitage, and one day a group of 5 or 6 pilgrims came to pray where he had lived. And they just took a picture of the place. And lo and behold, when the negative came out, another gentleman was on it. It was your man, long dead. At least the Lord gave a photograph of him in that way after he had died, when he was already in glory. If you're interested in this, just go into my website and you'll find that story of St. Sharbel. If you look into, it's the complete film actually, The Threshold of Paradise. If you go into the media section, you'll find a whole lot of things coming up, but one of them is the actual complete film, which John did. It's quite long, but it's a complete documentary on the monastic life, basically. The Threshold of Paradise is the title, but fairly near the beginning, you've got the story of Sharbel Makhlùf with pictures, including that picture on it. So just be aware that is there, because it can be something that could help you to understand what the eremitic call is all about. It's taking to a logical conclusion the rights of God over his creature. God has rights, and he can call some out of humanity to be nothing but his servants in praise. It makes sense in the mystical body. We don't have to justify that gratuitous praise. As in heaven, some angels do nothing at all to do with the earth, but just praise and praise and praise. Hagios, Agios, Agios, Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus. And they're here, waiting for us to echo that with the Sanctus here. Therefore we sing it. We don't whiz through it. These are angelic words, and we do them properly. Everything pertaining to God we do properly. He who sings prays twice, and therefore that element which we've got also in common with the East, where every word is sung, does actually have an impact. Why? It gives glory to God, giving the best and only the best. It gives time to God, plenty of time and not measured. And also it consoles us, because we create an ambiance in which we find something which raises us up above the banal. Because when it goes to church and finds more of the same thing, we are meeting ourselves again. And that's actually what's happening in many churches. There is no mystery or experience of the other. It's more of the same thing. The type of music said, used, all the rest of it, more of the same thing. Whereas we have a right to something, yes, mystical. It is part of our heritage, and we can do it with a little effort. There was one suicide in France some years ago, and he left a letter, and he was addressing different groups of people, and he said, "À vous les chrétiens, je dis," to you Christians I say, and of course the Catholic country, you see, France, "À vous les chrétiens, je dis, j'ai été enchanté par vos évangiles, I was enchanted by your gospels, mais j'ai été horrifié par vos assemblées, but I have been horrified by your assemblies." And actually that's quite surprising, because in France they're quite good, quite often. If he came to Ireland, I think he would have committed suicide in a very short time. With regard to what happened after his death, it didn't stop. they found that oil was oozing out of his tomb, and that became a very, very, very sought-after place of pilgrimage. By the thousand, they would come from far away in the early period after his death, and they still, I've got people who go to that part of the world, they get it straight away, and they know how important it is, and it goes around still, it's still there, and it does actually do miracles, indicating that these people have found what? They have found the innocence of Eden, because the Desert Fathers found again where we had come from. If you read some of the sayings and stories of the Desert Fathers, what do you find? Monks lying down by lions and this kind of thing. There was one, for instance, a lion was in trouble. He had a thorn in his paw, and he came limping, and this good hermit found him and took compassion on this fellow creature, for whom he could have been an interesting meal, and gently pulled out the thorn. Eventually, I can't remember how it happened, but there was an increase of persecution. It must have been one of the last great ones, either under Decius in 258 or under Diocletian in 304. They were rounding up even monks, apparently. So this good monk ended up in the arena, and he was about to be let loose with the lions, who I suppose would be fasting so as to increase their appetite. And this lion was one of them, and he recognized him and would not eat him up. That is interesting, but it's there. And you look at an animal, actually if you read Larry Cummins, he has one or two things to say on this. He's a farmer himself, and he has gifts, and he actually mentions it, that the animals do pick things up. And you see it. Look at the relationship between an animal and a little child. There's something there. Why? Because the child is still angelic. There's a goodness there, and there's something that goes across the board. So that is also a lesson, that we find that innocence again. And by the way, indirectly, it's the answer to a problem with regard to the tension in the air right now, e.g., that in Ireland, different from other countries, like Italy where I was ordained, there's an awful tension when you find yourself with a child. Well, there's no danger when you're aware precisely that the whole of creation is speaking of love. It's a question of misuse. That's the issue. Therefore, one does not take away what a child has a right to because of the misuse. That's an injustice. I remember when I was in Italy as a young priest, I was sent on a weekly basis to the mountain next to us where there was no resident priest, and you'd have, of course, children around you at the altar of all kinds, ages and sexes. When it came to the sign of peace, what does one do? Well, by instinct one turns around and gives them a peck on the cheek, or not on the cheek, on the forehead. I remember one little child there, she looked up at me, put up her lips as much as to say, "You're in Italy now, old bean. I want a proper one. That's no good to man or beast." But just to say how things change from one culture to another, but it's all taken on board because this excessive thing about coming close to a child, it's rather sad, you know. There's an overreaction. Let's get it balanced. Now, I just want to lead to one last thing, which is kind of important. In the East, where this good saint was operating, they have never lost one thing. It's that God, as well as being the closest friend of the soul, is the holy other. Look at the way they approach him. There is an anticipation of heaven and of its majesty in the very structure of their churches. Thus far and no further, the holy doors. And beyond, it's the Sancta Sanctorum, the Holy of Holies, where one takes off, as it were, one's shoes like Moses. Now you look at the way people trundle into the sacristy, trundle through the sanctuary, trundle all round the altar, make noises and all the rest of it in the presence of the invisible angels. Well, there they can't, because the holy doors will not let them through. And at the moment of Holy Communion, you know what happens, don't you? The priest is invisible. It's so intimate and other that he enters into a cloud of mystery. I noticed actually that some years ago when they had rebroadcast the marriage of Queen Elizabeth with the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, that at Holy Communion in Westminster Abbey, the royal couple were not shown. And there was just one comment. At this point, the royal couple are in intimacy with their God. That's interesting, isn't it? The way that was handled with great delicacy by the BBC. And now look at the way it's done. Now, in the East, there's something of that which has, of course, been kept to such an extent that it's led to the other, which we got over. It was there only just over a century ago in the Catholic Church in France, Jansenism still. The people were so afraid that they did not actually go to Holy Communion, more than the very minimum. But it's still there in the East that people go very rarely to Holy Communion. That's the other side of it. The other is this, that they have not developed, as we have, devotion to the Blessed Sacrament as we have. They have another way of approach. You watch an Eastern liturgy, and they're already in a position of profound adoration at the grand entry, when they're coming in with the holy gifts veiled like that, before the consecration. It's our offertory. But they don't pinpoint the moment of arrival of the presence as we do. The whole is consecratory. They only know that at the threefold Amen, it's happened. But the whole thing is pneumatic, is spirit-filled, is mysterious. And they don't like to pinpoint things as we do. Therefore, this fear and trembling, it's all sort of happening. And the body enters into it, which is another thing I want to dwell on for a second. The body enters into it. We have become neo-Protestants. The mind! You look at people now in church, sitting. It's all the mind. Very little for the imagination. Very little for the imagination of a child, actually. When I was an altar boy way back, there was an awful lot for a child to do at the altar. There was a whole army of us. There were six of them carrying candles. There were incense all over the place. It was all happening. And this is after the council in the early years. It was still like that for quite a long time. And that's all now been jettisoned. A child just stands or sits. Nothing happening. Well, it's a pity. It could happen and draw people in with genuine involvement, because a child means signs, involvement, things going around visibly. Then, with regard to rendering unto God his rights, the body enters into it. The charismatics actually have got it back to some extent. I noticed in France that there, in very good charismatic assemblies, liturgical ones, the body had been reclaimed, big time. And very interesting, because a lot of them were young, but very beautiful singing, boys and girls, because they have these new congregations coming out of all that, and very long liturgies in polyphony, with actually lots of Eastern stuff coming in, because they had imported the best of what they found everywhere. And the result was actually quite moving, very moving indeed. And we think that the shorter it is, the better. Well, we're depriving ourselves, let alone anyone else. And those assemblies, by the way, were the best advertisement possible. Because if you go into beauty, you are healed, and you come back. You go into ugliness, and you'll run a mile. So I finish then with this point. The body enters into it, but it also enters into it in another, this is the last point I make, which is very Eastern. If you go into an Eastern liturgy, because of its otherness, what happens? You enter bit by bit, not just in 20 minutes or whatever, because it's not enough, as in the West, but you enter into mode, into eternal mode, over 1, 2, 3 hours. And what happens is this: you are receiving, you are being ministered to by him, who has an opportunity and a space to do so. Because all the time you are exposed to very high language, suggesting all the time the maximum, very poetic and beautiful and theologically rich. And by the way, that kept the fullness of a certain theology alive even in communist times. It was all there in the liturgy. And then what happens is this, and it's your experience if you get into it as well. Bit by bit, one is transported with all one's being into not more of the same thing, but a different world. where one is all the time referring to our friends in the beyond, the uncreated light and all the rest of it. It's something so different that it cannot but transform one on a profound, profound level in such a way that, e.g., one is tranquil, one is made pacified and irenic. There is no ruffling of the soul after 3 hours of being exposed to that. It's quite an entry into the beyond and back. And it needs time. You can't crash into eternity and back in 20 minutes. It can't be done. And by the way, the Lord is trying to get it back in Ireland. You know how, don't you? And you're involved in it, each of you. By putting on your heart to go or to get going Eucharistic adoration. Because that's where, under our modality, we get it quite easily. Because the same thing can happen if we're tranquil, but only if we enter into the game. And don't crowd out our Lord by noisy adoration. Because many people, from the beginning of the year to the end of the adoration, don't stop muttering prayers or doing things, rattling, anything but be quiet. But it's missing the whole point. It's the same with human love. If you can't be quietly with your beloved, you have not yet relaxed. You're still on the nervous stage, blocking out embarrassing silences. It's exactly the same with the Lord Jesus. He wants our intimacy, not our noise, mental noise. So I finish, my friends. There's a word for it. It's called hesychasm. Hesychia in Greek is silence, but it's stillness. It's far more than just silence. And it's the whole of Eastern spiritual, monastic spirituality coming into mode, because what happens is this. The whole of the Eastern particular spirituality is based on this element of leaving what is carnal and passing and entering into the eternal mode of what is not ruffled. And to do so, we need a great, and I say a great effort. We can't get there by shortcut means. Eternity is eternally difficult to attain, and we think we can do it with the quickie.